Kirstin Blaze Lobato sits in a Nevada prison, accused of a crime she says she didn't commit. She has had 2 trials, the first finding her guilty of first-degree murder, and the second finding her guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Over 150,000 people have signed a petition asking prosecutors to re-examine Ms. Lobato's conviction, but they have refused, continuing to spend taxpayer money fighting Lobato's appeals to the Nevada Supreme Court. This series takes a look at the evidence of the case and asks you to decide whether Ms. Lobato's appeal is something the state of Nevada should continue to fight. First, some background. A homeless man named Duran Bailey was found dead on July 8, 2001. He was badly beaten and his penis was severed. For nearly 2 weeks, homicide detectives claimed they had no leads until a probation officer from Pioche, Nevada, 177 miles north of Las Vegas, called them asking if they had a case where a man's penis was cut. The focus of their investigation then turned to Kirstin. Detectives Tom Thousand and Jim La Rochelle drove to Kirstin's hometown, Panaca, Nevada, to interview her. After the conversation was over, she was arrested. Her car was impounded, and she has been fighting to prove her innocence ever since. Prosecutors say their case is based around Ms. Lobato's statement to police, a statement they call a confession. But Lobato says her statement was about an entirely different incident that happened 2 months before Bailey was killed, and in a different part of town. Deputy District Attorney Steve Owens believes this case isn't about physical evidence. It's about an alleged confession. Quote, "This is not a DNA case. This is a confession case. Kirstin Lobato confessed to murder. She admitted to unique circumstances and facts that link her to this murder. But to understand Lobato's alleged confession, you must understand more about this story. In May of 2001, Lobato lived in Las Vegas. She was admittedly on drugs and living a life that had taken her down the wrong path. She says one night she was walking through the parking lot of a friend's rent-by-week hotel when a man grabbed her, threw her on the ground, and tried to rape her. She fought back, pulling a knife out of her pocket and cutting the man's penis. She ran, first to a friend's house, then to a church, and then to Panaca. 2 months later, Duran's body was found beaten, with his penis severed. Lobato was interviewed by police at her home in Panaca nearly 2 weeks after Bailey's body was found. Detectives call the interview a confession. D.A. Owens claims Lobato knew details about the case that no one else did, specifically the severed penis. But apparently that's the only thing she knew about the case. In Lobato's statement, she says the attack happened, quote, over a month ago. She also describes an attack happening on the opposite side of town as where Bailey's body was found. Dr. Allison Redlick, a professor at the University of Albany who is an expert in false confessions, took a look at Lobato's alleged confession. She believes Lobato did not confess to the murder of Duran Bailey, but told police about an attack that occurred over a month before Bailey was killed. Quote, "It is my expert opinion that Ms. Lobato was not confessing to the murder of Mr. Bailey. Rather, she was confessing to an assault in which she was the alleged victim and in which she defended herself by attempting to cut the penis of a man." She goes on to say, "It appears to me that Ms. Lobato believed that she was cooperating with a police investigation, not admitting to a murder that occurred on the other side of town some weeks after her alleged assault." Dr. Redlick believes that while Lobato's case isn't an example of a classic false confession, it does have the hallmarks of a typical false confession case, including inconsistencies surrounding the way the crime occurred. Further, Dr. Redlick explains that most false confessions involve cases where the only evidence tying the suspect to the victim is the confession itself. More on that later. Other evidence that Lobato's statement to police wasn't a confession to Bailey's murder? She told several people about her attack before Bailey was killed. Multiple witnesses were ready to testify that Lobato told them that a man attacked her in May of 2001, but they were excluded from testifying under the court's hearsay rules. One of those witnesses could even prove when Lobato told her of the attack. Kimberly Grindstaff signed an affidavit that Lobato told her she was attacked while the pair were traveling to Cedar City, Utah to attend the opening night of the Utah Shakespearean Festival. That was June 21st, 2001. Duran Bailey was killed over 2 weeks later. The crime scene where Duran Bailey's body was found was a horrible sight. His body lay inside a dumpster enclosure covered in trash. He was badly beaten and his penis was severed. Most of Bailey's teeth were knocked out. His carotid artery was slit. The coroner ruled he died from blunt force trauma with stab wounds as a contributing factor. With the violence of Bailey's death, you would expect Kirstin Lobato to have left some evidence behind, but she didn't. In fact, the evidence suggests Duran Bailey's killer was a man. At the crime scene, investigators found a bloody footprint left on a piece of cardboard. Detectives have never discovered who left that print, and in court, prosecutors never tried to explain where it came from. They just pretended like the evidence wasn't there. Defense investigators were interested and hired forensic expert George Shiro to look at the prints. He determined they came from a men's shoe manufactured by Walmart. Police collected Lobato's shoes and were unable to find a match. Then there's the DNA. Investigators collected blood samples from the scene and tested them for DNA. They found DNA belonging to Bailey and DNA left by an unknown source. Lobato was excluded as a source of DNA from all evidence collected at the scene. As false confession expert Dr. Allison Redlick says, in proven false confession cases there is often no other evidence linking the suspect to the crime except the false confession statement. Despite all the evidence that investigators collected, police have never been able to place Kirstin Lobato at the scene of this crime. When Duran Bailey's body was found, he was homeless and living on the streets. He was a known crack user and had previous arrests for domestic violence. 3 days before his murder, Diane Parker called police and told them Bailey raped her. Parker gave a statement to a detective and nurses performed a rape examination. But that's where the investigation into her assault ended. Police failed to follow up on the case, and there is little evidence that the investigation went anywhere beyond her original statement. Parker's friends witnessed her being abused by Bailey. The day of the rape, Parker was talking to neighbors when Bailey walked up to her and slapped her across the face. One of her neighbors physically intervened and Bailey left. Bailey allegedly came back later that night, forced his way into Parker's apartment, and repeatedly raped her. He was found dead just days later. Parker's apartment was about 1,000 yards away from where Bailey's body was found. Police appeared to have made little effort to identify a suspect in Duran Bailey's death. They spoke to Diane Parker, but did not follow up with her neighbors. On the stand, Detective Tom Thousand said he did a simple background check on one of the neighbors, but he never interviewed any of them about the crime. Police also appeared to have made no effort to identify the person who left the bloody shoe print at the scene. When detectives went to Diane Parker's apartment to talk to her, they visually inspected the shoes they found inside, but they did not perform further tests. During their investigation, defense attorneys also found that Bailey's checkbook had been used, with checks clearing his bank after he died. Police never investigated this lead to determine if Bailey actually wrote those checks, and by the time defense investigators found out about the checks, the bank had already destroyed them. Duran Bailey was pronounced dead just before 4 a.m. on July 8, 2001. For Kirstin Lobato to be his killer, the prosecution wants you to believe a series of facts that are hard to swallow. On July 5th, Lobato went to a doctor in Panaca, 165 miles away from the crime scene. On July 6th, she took a drug test and passed. Prosecutors want you to believe that she needed meth on July 7th, so she headed south to Las Vegas. In their closing statements, prosecutors say Lobato found meth from Bailey, a homeless man living in a dumpster enclosure with a history of using crack, but no history of using meth. At some point, prosecutors want you to believe that this drug deal goes south, and Lobato beats Bailey to death, stabs him, and severs his penis. Lobato, who weighed about 100 pounds at the time of her arrest, then drags the 160-pound Bailey behind the dumpster, covers him in trash, and flees the scene without leaving a single piece of evidence that she was there. Prosecutors say she made it back to Panaca on the morning of July 8th and was picked up by a friend to return to Las Vegas. When looked at objectively, this story is nonsensical. Prosecutors admit that Lobato had a source for her meth in Las Vegas, but there is no evidence that this source was Bailey, and it is doubtful that an 18-year-old girl's drug connection was a 44-year-old homeless man who lived on a limited income. They rely on a speculative narrative that is not supported by any actual evidence. There is no evidence that Kirstin Lobato left Panaca on July 7th. There is no evidence that she knew Duran Bailey. There is no evidence that she was at the crime scene. In fact, the only evidence of a suspect collected from the crime scene comes from an unknown man who stepped in Duran Bailey's blood. Lobato is now trying to do the impossible: get the Nevada Supreme Court to overturn a second conviction. She has support from over 150,000 people who signed a petition asking the Clark County District Attorney to stop opposing her appeal and to test and retest evidence found at the scene using technology not available in 2001. The Innocence Project, a New York-based nonprofit group run by famed defense attorney Barry Scheck, has offered to pay for the tests to be performed, but the county has refused. If you would like more information about this case, go to justiceforkirstin.com.